All right, welcome to this week's Hangops. I'm Christopher Weber, for those that haven't done this before. At this point, we have an open topic, and we're waiting on hopefully the folks at DevOps Days Toronto to join us. Otherwise, anyone out there in user land, love for you to come hang out with us. It's kind of weird knowing that there are people watching, but I'm not talking. Hey, how's it going, man?
Hey, dude.
So, you got anything specific you want to talk about, or just I can ask random questions. I'm good at that.
Now just hanging out for now.
Oh, very nice. Working on anything fun this week?
I'm doing deployment stuff with Jenkins through Puppet and Ansible. So
Oh,
that's fun.
nice. Now, when you say through Puppet and Ansible, what are you like? What parts of Puppet and what parts of Ansible are you using in that pipeline?
I'm using Ansible to just like push over SSH keys because our cloud provider that we have doesn't manage SSH keys. It's all bare
Okay.
metal. So using Ansible to push over SSH keys, and then from there using Puppet to provision the server all the way up.
Okay, cool. So basically, using Ansible as a way to get it to the point where you can bootstrap the box. Like, so where does your
Yeah.
Puppet client get actually set up? Are you guys doing that as part of the initial install, or are you guys like I guess the provisioning of the box, if you will? But
Yeah. Uh, we're, we're doing it as part of the provisioning. So it's we're bootstrapping it to install a certain version of Puppet, and then just running Puppet standalone.
okay, so you're basically running it in Puppet apply mode.
Yep.
That's actually kind of cool. I thought about going that direction, um, mainly because my favorite part of Puppet these days is still Puppet apply. Like,
That's just
I,
go do this.
yeah, exactly. I don't have Puppet on any of my boxes. Well, that's not true. I don't have it on any of like my local boxes, but there's still a few boxes that I manage that have Puppet running because, frankly, I haven't had time to go through and well, puppetbestpractices.com. Like, that would be hilarious to host from a box running chef. But the idea of for me just taking the time to cut the code over, I just haven't had time to do.
Right.
And the Puppet config works just fine for now, and that's exactly what I'm doing because like there's no like hosted chef equivalent to Puppet, um, unless actually does anyone. We only have 3 viewers, so I'm not sure anybody's going to hear me. But if anyone that listens to this after the fact knows of anyone that does hosted Puppet provider stuff, that would be exciting to hear about because like I know a few people that have either attempted to stand it up themselves or like it would be nice to have when you're testing and playing with things instead of like, okay, I've got to go stand up the Puppet Master. And then there's that pain in the ass of if you want to do something that's not WebRick, you have to like stand it up by hand because I've never found enough. I've always run into like the magic problems dealing with around cert generation to be too much for my Puppet manifest. Like I was never able to get it to a point where I could deploy a Puppet master with Puppet. I managed
Oh, right.
with Puppet, but to actually get it stood up was always a pain in the ass.
Like how you can install the Chef server with Chef Solo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, I got close, like, because the idea being right that you could, in concept, start with the box running Puppet, and then apply, like, run Puppet apply, or git pull or git clone Puppet apply, and actually because I'm lazy, you know, curl bash from the internal Git repo that
Right.
pulls down a shell script that just installs Puppet and walks through the steps. But I always had problems with this, with automating the cert generation. And I would love if someone actually has like code that magically handles that, so I can just light up Passenger. That would be so kick-ass.
So we're running like without a master puppet or a puppet master, but we're using Fabric to be able to kick off the puppet applies. So it's pretty cool.
That is awesome, actually. Yeah,
So we don't have to mess with any of the certs or anything. We just have SSH keys, kind of like Ansible, but then we use Fabric over SSH to just kick off puppet applies.
well, and what always made me sad was like it's still frustrating because like you want to talk about pain. Like anybody, I make this challenge. Anybody wants to talk about this pain, please find me at an event, and I will buy you a beer, and we will talk about the pain that is exported resources. But like, I always loved the idea of exported resources, and it was stupid shit, right? Like, I've always been responsible for shit like backups and Nagios and the things that like you need a central coordination server whether you want a central coordination server or not. So
Right.
it's painful because you want exported resources and you can use exported resources with the Puppet Master, but that's still painful. And then like my favorite uses of Puppet are and Chef for that matter are the ability to like add new things to Ohio and Factor and then have it show up in a database.
Yep.
Once again, a drinking story. This guy has actually written code to go pull data out of the exported I don't think I've done it out of PuppetDB, but the MySQL backend that used to be used by the exported resources store, and I would pull all that data, format it, and then shove it into Confluence using Ruby. And that job would run once a day, and it would check to see if basically it would pull the page, diff what it had generated, and if it was different, then it would upload it. Otherwise, it would just move on to the next one.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, no, don't do that. It's bad.
But you would almost have like a live generated documentation.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what it was. And then I did some like way crazy shit where like you can store information about a page without it being in the page in Confluence. So like you could go in and there were little drop downs that you could select and like, oh, I'm going to do this thing, and provide extra information that you wouldn't be able to provide like to Puppet, which generally turned into, no, really, we don't want this to be in Confluence. Just fucking set a fact.
Right.
And apparently, talking about Puppet causes me to cuss more than I usually do.
The one thing I miss mostly from Puppet is I don't have Test Kitchen. I don't have a way to test individual manifests through Vagrant easily.
So apparently, there is a Puppet test kitchen.
Yeah, I submitted code to it, and the maintainer, he took a month to apply my pull request.
I have much more. What's the word I'm looking for here? Empathy for people that take long times to pull and pull requests, because I feel like a total jackass. Like I am totally responsible for 100+ cookbooks, and I have like probably 200+ open pull requests right now, and it's painful because it's like, in fact, I was doing some really neat stuff for IAS this morning, like
Mm-hmm.
great code, but so there's two things. Number one, Test Kitchen really doesn't provide a way to test the reconverge thing, and when the thing that is being fixed is on the second time around, the site ID doesn't get fixed, you can't use Test Kitchen. Not to mention, like, once again, and this goes probably worth actually discussing at Summit. So quick plug, the Chef Community Summit's coming up October 1st and 2nd in Seattle, so come join us. But no, I run into this place where it's like, well, I don't actually want to test using Vagrant on my local machine using a Windows image that no one else has access to. So I like am crazy anal about, if it can't be tested in the cloud, I'm not going to call that testing, because to me, I need to be able to say to you or to Paul, this is what I did to test it. And in fact, I've got an IIS test cookbook right now. And what I've been doing is, if you pull knife EC2 master from, knife EC2 from master, you can actually test. So the current version of knife EC2, you can actually test 2012 and 2012 R2. But with the latest version of knife EC2, which is sitting on master right now, you can actually pull down and test 2008 and 2008 R2. So, cool. Not that you're stuck testing Windows.
Has that gotten better, or is Windows still just a complete joy to work with, or is it?
It's an interesting thing, right? Like, are there still things that are painful to me? Absolutely. But there are still things that are painful about working with Solaris and with FreeBSD and working with Ubuntu. Right. Like, and arguably, how do I put this nicely? If you can't tell me why the software you're working with sucks, it tells me you haven't worked with it long enough. Like, if MongoDB solves all your problems and you don't understand why everybody has their arms about it, you probably haven't used it enough. And the same goes for Puppet and Chef. Like, if you are have used Chef long enough and you can't tell me things that you don't like about Chef, I don't believe that you've used it enough to consider yourself an intermediate to expert user, because, like, every software has warts. I mean, except for DJB's software, but that's another discussion. I may have been around the internet a little while. But to answer your question more directly, my biggest frustration today is that I don't have a way to remote shell into a box while running on my Mac. Like, I don't have a PowerShell equivalent of SSH. Outside of that, it's not bad at all. Like, I run knife EC2 to light up the instance. I drop the information into my into remote desktop, and like Steve Murawski is like his ears are gonna pop up, and he's gonna come and yell at me for using remote desktop. But I mean, it works, right? Um, and at this point, I remote desktop to a box, and I actually just use PowerShell once I'm on the box to test what's going on, because it's easy. You do the same things you would in Linux. It just slightly different commands. But if you want to talk about bad command line syntax, like, once again, let's go drink, because it's going to take some drinking to explain Sun1, iPlanet, whatever it's, Netscape messaging server command line arguments, or my favorite forever will be, and I to this day have not used it enough. I've used it enough to be scared of it. For the old school admins out there, Veritas volume manager, like, oh, maybe Hangops at times I should just have shots of scotch to quell the pain. So yeah, but yeah, it's getting better. It's getting way better than it ever was, and I have this gut feeling that if I were to go get a what is it called? Like, go down and buy a Surface Pro 3 and had the Windows tools, it would be a delight. Like, because from what I understand, what I want to be able to do, I can do sitting on a Surface box. So yeah.
I think working with Windows versus Linux, it's just a matter of which one sucks less at that moment.
Yeah, and it's funny to go down that path, because some of the major distros, it seems like they're making it more painful to use, whereas Windows is making it less painful to use. It's weird how that, like, paradigm shift is happening right now.
Yeah, and I know Lucis is real upset with systemd and everything.
Yeah, there's a lot of systemd shenanigans. People in two camps over it. They either really love it, or they really hate it. I haven't spent enough time digging into it to really have an opinion, but it just it seems like a weird step.
And it's hard, right? Because, like, the argument that's being made, I see it, but, like, it's no different than a lot of the stuff that happened with SMF in Solaris, and I would argue that, like, having used SMF, I miss it when I'm in Linux land, but I haven't played with systemd enough to really have an opinion yet. With that said, there are some open pull requests on the Chef Client cookbook that make systemd stuff work, so that's on my list of things to play with, assuming I don't conference too hard over the next 3 weeks.
I just know that a lot of people are upset about systemd because it violates a lot of Unix fundamental philosophies of do one thing well, and that's trying to manage a whole lot of that. But I don't know how much of that is against that philosophy or not. And I'm too young to really know the RMS true Unix philosophy on everything. So
It's also hard to work out which is, like, what's reality and what's the perception, unless you're at the low level of it and seeing what it's actually doing. Is it really trying to do everything at once, or is it trying to do, like, is it pretty modular and has a bunch of modules all doing one thing really well? So again, without getting deep into systemd, which I haven't yet, and hopefully I don't have to anytime soon, I can't really form an opinion.
I feel like there's an open spaces forming here at the community summit to talk systemd and how that impacts the cookbooks we write and whatnot. And maybe, so once again, because I'm full of plugs today, I'll be at mobile or modern mobile web conf or something. I forget what the exact name of it. MMW conf or con at UCLA next week. The following week I'll be at PuppetConf, and the following week I will be at Chef Community Summit. So, like, if you're at any of those, come hit me up and we'll talk these things, because I think there's a lot there. I'm looking forward to sitting down and kind of hacking on systemd. I just it's I'm drowning so much in like chef code right now that to even surface long enough to just go play with something to play with it um, is hard to find time for right now.
Yeah. So I've played around with it a little bit because I've been messing around with CoreOS a little bit, and that's what it uses with Fleet to do its container orchestration. And I mean, from stopping and starting services, like it's really easy to it's as easy as run it or any of the other newer things to write the service config files. It is a little bit weird once you've started it. You have to run like journal cattle to read the logs because they're in some weird binary format, and that's kind of weird. And I don't know how that's gonna play out for like how it's gonna handle centralized logging, Splunk, Logstash, whatever. I think yeah, I have to see where that gets to.
That makes sense. And I mean, it was when to be fair, when we went through this on Solaris 10, like from the Solaris 9 to Solaris 10 using SMF, it was confusing as fuck. Well, first off, you had XML involved, so like that right there um, was interesting. But once you got used to the way things worked and it stopped doing stupid things, like because the original release of it was really painful. The first time you had your SMF, I forget what it was called, but essentially there was like a registry that gets compiled to speed things up, and that registry can get corrupted, and you end up in this place where it doesn't actually start services or get past. Um, they weren't really run levels, but the equivalent of run levels. Yeah, it was painful at first, but once you got used to it and could write the SMF manifest, it was bitching because you could introspect the system in ways that you weren't able to do it in the past. Not to mention, what was the other thing that they added? The fault management framework, or fault management FMD, fault management daemon, I guess was the. So I guess it was FMF, fault management framework. But yeah, you got these cool URLs that probably don't work anymore because yay Oracle. But um, it would return back a URL. You would go to the URL and it would tell you exactly what the hell that error message meant and ways to troubleshoot it. Unless it was like the 9,000 error, and then you're like, ah, crap. So yeah, how about you, Paul? What are you working on? It sounds like CoreOS and Docker.
Well, right now I'm working on a loaner laptop, which is painful. My MacBook Pro died on Monday, and I've got this 3-year-old MacBook Pro with like spinning things inside of it and very small amounts of memory, and yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy how quickly you get used to having like a decent box with decent RAM and an SSD. So now like I run Vagrant something and I cannot do anything else on the box, like apart from like check email.
That is insane.
Yeah.
Like, oh, yeah.
So
Now I'm spoiled. So my work provided box is a 13-inch MacBook Pro with 16 gigs of RAM, and because I'm a goofball, that is a really big laptop to me. So I travel with my little 11-inch Air with 8 gigs of RAM, and yeah, like I don't actually miss the 13-inch because it's so big. But yeah, in fact I've got it right here. Like,
So on the
although
topic of laptops, what are people using for Linux laptops these days? It seems like it's still difficult and painful to maintain running Linux on a MacBook Pro. Um, Most of the decent Windows-based laptops seem to have NVIDIA cards, which raises its own problems with Linux. So I'm kind of curious to see, because I keep wanting to switch back to running a Linux laptop, but just trying to find one with the specs that's not crazy and going to run into all sorts of weirdness with Linux.
I think Sputnik is still where people are going. At least that's the last I heard. But I don't honestly know. Like, I'm gonna sound like a total asshole right now, but like the idea of running Linux on the desktop just does not excite me at all. Like, And it's funny. It gets back to we each find our way of working, right? Like
Mhm.
there are some people and we all probably know them that like you watch them use a tiled window manager and you just like it's just like mind blown.
Right.
I can't even imagine what you just did with your fingers, but it had to have been like awesome because I just saw what happened on your screen and like that was awesome. Um,
I have a tiled window manager in my MacBook.
you can do that?
Yeah, it's Slate.js, and then I just write a JavaScript configuration, and then I just have Vim keybinds to tile window manager in my OS 10 environment.
That's kind of neat. I'm a full screen app kind of person, but I also run an 11-inch MacBook Air. Like, there's not much room for anything more than the one thing on the screen.
Right.
And then I use Tmux to do all the actual needful
The
things.
terminal splitting and
Although I do have a cool like suggestion for those folks if I can get the stupid thing out. So give me a second here.
I think as far as Linux laptops go, the one that worked the best for me was a Chromebook.
Mm-hmm.
So it's already running Linux.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have like that memory limitation, or yeah, the spec limitation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, even the Sputnik has got 8 gigs soldered on memory, so you can't really upgrade to 16. And running DevStack is these days a 6 gig minimum VM, so it starts to
Oh, I was about
get
to
into
say,
the
well,
weeds.
you work for a provider that has a cloud thingy. You should probably just use the cloud. But if you're working on the cloud, building the cloud in the cloud, that might result in a thunderstorm.
Right.
Um,
And also you still get much quicker feedback when you're at your laptop working on your laptop.
I can see that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's not like the one guy that was working on his iPad, but just SSHing into like DigitalOcean droplets to do all his work in.
I've thought about it. I honestly have, especially having two laptops. Like as soon as you go to two machines, like, yay, first world problems.
Well,
Uh,
also you go somewhere with a bad connection or no connection, and suddenly you can't do any work.
yeah, I got like my last flight from United, I got a survey back, and what can we do to improve Wi-Fi? What would have made things better? Wi-Fi. And I think they asked one more question. I just said Wi-Fi. Yes, it's an hour-long flight from San Francisco to Ontario, but not having Wi-Fi makes me sad. So total random like workstation or like laptop suggestion. Um, you probably can't see it, but in the video I've got this little thing called a Snuglet. And if you actually use your laptop on your lap, and let me rephrase that, if you use your MacBook or MacBook Air on your lap, um, it makes your power cable actually stick in a decent amount. So like this is without it, like it just comes out. Oh, gotta do this the right direction. This makes it so you can actually like have it on your lap and it doesn't just like fall out of nowhere. Like it still comes out, but it's in there a little tighter. Chris's random pick of the week. Um, so I'm gonna reverse your question earlier though, Paul. Like, what are people running as Windows laptops? Like, if I was gonna go buy a small Windows laptop, that had decent specs, anyone have thoughts on that? Like,
I haven't run Windows in years.
me either, which is why I'm having this problem, right? Like,
Yeah.
But I would assume that people would just be happy with the Surface, right?
I think that's the direction I'm gonna go. Like, because and I've said it a few times, um, and I don't know when I'm going to make this switch. I'm determined, and I probably will do it after the first of the year, is my guess at this point. Um, but like, pick up a Windows box and run it as my primary workstation for a little while. By a little while, at least 3 months, just to make sure. Like, I have this word community in my title, so I feel like it's important that I'm not just like, oh, I'm a hipster running my Mac. Like, I'm awesome. Like, I actually take the time to experience other people's pain. And if Windows is painful, we should fix that because I hate like people having pain. So that's my random community contribution today. But yeah, how is CoreOS and Fleet? Like,
So I've been having a lot of fun playing with it. Basically, I've been using Heat to spin up a CoreOS cluster on Rackspace Cloud,
mm-hmm,
and that's kind of cool. Figuring through the heat stuff to do that, and then using etcd and Fleet and confd to do configuration of services.
mm-hmm,
And so I've got a 3-node Pacona Galera cluster that spins up in Fleet, and so Fleet spins up a data container, a volume container, and a MySQL container for each one, and Fleet tells it that they can't coexist on the same box, so it will automatically spread them across the 3 nodes. And in the start command, they spit out a bunch of information about themselves to etcd, and then they all read that etcd key value pair and then reconfigure themselves based on the values in there. And so if I add another node to the cluster, and there's an HA proxy in there to do the load balancing as well. So I add another one and it automatically gets picked up. It automatically adds itself and starts replicating, and HA proxy goes, oh, there's a new thing, I'll hup myself and load balance that as well. And that's pretty cool. And so just from changing etcd keys, and then what happens is there's a time to live of like 30 seconds on the etcd key,
mm-hmm,
and so I have a loop in the start command of the Docker container that basically checks to see if it's still listening on port 3306 just using netstat, and if it is, it rewrites the key every 15 seconds.
mm-hmm.
So it's always keeping ahead of the time to live. And so if it dies, then etcd is pretty quick to find out that it's dead and removes it from the load balancer and all that stuff.
So how do you like? Okay, so I'll throw out my like big concern with a lot of these things is it's that database layer. Like, if you're using something that's designed, even the awesome databases that are designed to have shit come and go, like they're still like reconverge phases.
Mm-hmm.
I always worry about we stood this thing up using, we stood this database up using something that's designed to make things come and go ephemerally. And oh crap, our MySQL instance just went away, or our Postgres instance just went away,
Right.
or heaven forbid, yes, Mongo is awesome and you've got this replica set, except that when one of them reboots, it still causes things to shit themselves. Like, how do you deal with those things, or are you avoiding running the database stuff on top of this stuff, or is that just if it does bad things, that's up to the database?
Yeah, so I mean, right now it's just an experiment for me. So I'm just kind of figuring out. Like, I just picked an application and said I'm going to figure out if I can run this, and I'm sort of working through it with the Galera replication and using the extra backup SST, which is what transfers the data back and forth to new slaves.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty inobtrusive, so you don't end up with like locking reads or anything on the existing databases. So it
Okay.
seems to be pretty good. And it's not something you want to do constantly. It's not, it's more of if you need it to auto heal itself because one node's gone down, not because you're spinning up and spinning down nodes, every 20 minutes.
Okay,
I'm
that
sure
makes sense.
I'm sure. And if your data set's pretty small, then, it's pretty quick to catch up.
Nice. Well, and then, I mean, when you get into that data set discussion, right, like if what you're trying to do is optimize for the ability for it to heal itself,
Right.
you don't do stupid things like put, a data set of, we'll use an arbitrary number, a data set of 100 terabytes and shove that across 2 boxes.
Right.
You take that data set of 100 terabytes and spread it off, across 5 to 6 boxes to help with that problem.
Yep.
Hmm. So just totally random because I was playing with. We were sitting at a big data meetup the other day talking. Did you guys know that you can get like single 4U boxes with 3 terabytes of RAM in them? I,
As in single CPU or multiple CPU?
well, like a single like logical system. It's a 4U box that has 4 core or 4 sockets and 3 terabytes of RAM.
That's pretty badass.
I want to run VMware on it. Yes, I'm going to collapse down my entire data center into this one box. Which, as I say that, like in total smartassery, like I know that there are some organizations that have data centers that would probably collapse down onto like 2 of those. Not to mention, it's got a whole lot of drive bays, so you can fill those up with like 800 gig SSDs
Hmm.
and RAID 6 across them. Wow. I the interesting thing to me is how almost awkward it is to talk about hardware anymore. And I wonder like how that changed, right?
Well, is it just because we've moved away from caring about hardware for the most? Like most of us are working on the cloud, right? So hardware is not a real thing. It's like something that someone else cares about,
It's all abstracted out.
right?
Like I don't have to worry about, if I get a disk failure or anything else, that's my provider's problem.
Yeah, and I agree
Or I
with
mean,
that.
like hardware-wise, I have to monitor it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you just put in a ticket and be like, "Hey, go fix this, please." And when I was at my last company, it wasn't even our concern. Like we that was the systems engineering folks. They maintained like watching for those sorts of things, and because we were huge proponents of moving to virtualized infrastructure, like we didn't care about disk failures because disk failures, like that was at a level we didn't even have access to. But yeah, I've just been really pondering, like as a sysadmin, like what got me in the game, right, was walking into a data center and be like, this is the coolest thing ever. Um, and some of my best war stories are I unseated, I went to go, and Jake, this may be this may date me and make you feel really young, so apologies. But we had these V880s, which is a Sun Microsystems Spark box, and like I yanked or not yanked, but we did a replacement of a memory DIMM on one of the system boards and put the system board back, and the system didn't come back up, like it hung. And this is like $250,000 box. So we we ended up reseating the system board, and the box came up, but still, like that was kind of scary as a student because I was a student sysadmin at that point.
Right. I'm still a student, but it's kind of weird how I spent a year in a data center working in a data center, and now I'm working remote, and I don't even touch any hardware except for my laptop. And even still, as like a student, kind of like a very very junior into this position and field, like I'm not even touching any hardware. All right, and if everything's running right, I don't even SSH into our web servers, right? It's all remotely configured.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess it's a good thing. Like, no one's ever going to have to come by later and explain what it means to be Sun safe on the serial console servers because someone just jerked the PM2E and sent half the data center to the OK prompt. Like, I mean, how many people even know what the hell I'm talking about is the best part, right? And Jake, you probably don't if you haven't worked with Sun Gear. So,
Yeah,
okay.
I've been fortunate enough to avoid working with Sun Gear. I was HPUX instead.
Well, okay, so this is actually something I miss about Solaris or not Solaris, but Sun Hardware. So first off, even their x86 gear, serial consoles were first-class citizens, which meant when I racked and stacked gear, I only the only piece of equipment I had to get configured before I left the data center was the serial console. And I didn't have to run a fuck ton of KVM cables, because if you've ever had to run, like if you have any desire for your rack to look clean and tidy, running VGA and a or actually
a PS2 for your keyboard, and
yeah, or even a USB, like New School, we run the USBs. Not that that works on half the servers I dealt with over the years, but and that's also a way you can tell like Sun admins that have been around that came from a Windows world. You'll find you used to go into data centers and you'd find Creator 3D cards or frame buffers in the servers, and you would just be sad because like there's no need for there to be a frame buffer or video card for that matter inside a Sunbox. But anyway, you could do all these cool things via serial. One of the things you could do is you could send a break signal or from a Sun keyboard a stop A, and it would drop you into the BIOS, so you could like you could essentially quiesce the machine, ask it questions in the BIOS, and then hit OK or type OK again, or I think it was actually go, and the system would do its thing.
cool.
What was neat about this is when the box was like hard hung, you could type you could drop into the BIOS or into the PROM, which is what it was called, not BIOS, and you could do neat things like send the sync command, and it would force a kernel dump. So if you had enough swap configured, you could actually do like crazy Brendan Gregg shit and figure out what the hell went wrong. Not that I ever actually figured out how to do that, but Sun engineers could do that, and you could send them the thing, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, your shit got broke here." So
That's insane.
And I think you can still do that on x86, just so that I'm not super crazy, but it's called a non-maskable interrupt. And it usually has to be enabled, and like, yeah. Insert yak shave on the NMIs.
Like now, if we have, or like for me, if I have something that goes down, I can just throw it away and rebuild a new one, within a couple minutes, and then figure out what happened to the old one, or just, take the old one that broke out of my load balancer rotation, spin up a new one, add it in, and then start my debugging process. And, it's no longer the run around for live trying to get stuff up anymore.
Well, and that's one of the things that's changed in industry as well, right? Like a lot of the applications, it really wasn't necessarily possible. You always ended up with some single point of failure in most cases. Like even with email, you ended up with a single data store, right? Like there was a box that was the mailbox server for some group of users. It eventually got better, and we're now at a point where like it's replicated and all that good stuff. But growing up, there was the faculty staff mail server. There was the student email server, and yeah, that ran on a V880 or a V890. You had these boxes with 3 power supplies. As a side note, you actually needed 2 of them to run, but that's a whole other discussion. With all sorts of like weird out-of-band features and whatnot. But yeah, when someone did something stupid, that box went down, and you had to bring it back up, or you need to replace a disk. Well,
Like it was all about maintaining that one system as opposed to just getting it up as quickly as possible. So
yeah.
like you made all these field checks to like maintain that system for as long as possible.
Exactly, and that's the road to pain, because what really the killer is if you go and look at Unix lore, if you will, you will find lots and lots of discussion about uptime. Like, yeah, not gonna lie, I've been on boxes with 600, 700, 800 days of uptime. In fact, when I was at UCR, the campus NMTP server was still running Solaris 5.7 x86 on a compact box from 1998, but that's another story. Like, you deal with this problem of there's this configuration drift that happens, and like you actually don't have any way of knowing that that box is going to come up when you reboot it. Like
Right.
I got in the habit when I was at both of my jobs in academia, or well, at all of my positions. I always made a point to like do a ps-ef of everything running on that system before doing the reboot thing, because you didn't know if someone actually wrote a start script. There may be software, or my favorite will forever be, oh, we did an upgrade of Open LDAP, or Sun's LDAP server, and the new version is in this directory, but the start script is still pointed at the old one because we had to start the new one manually as part of the upgrade procedure. Yeah, that screwed me. Or yes, continuing down, I've got war stories today. My favorite will forever be the LDAP server's down. Okay, SSH to the box. There's no LDAP server here, like, at all. Like, it's not installed even. And you start looking, and you finally find this this process called balance. And what the hell is balance? You do a little Googling to find out that, oh, balance is actually a load balancing thing. And you realize that it isn't configured either in a start script. It just is running right now. So if this box reboots, Lord knows. And you find the command line arguments that point at this box over here. So you go to the other box to find out, oh, the LDAP server is actually down because it's over on this other box over here that we didn't even know about. We'll start that bad boy up here in a jiffy. And hey, it works. Because that's never happened to me. But, I think for those of us that have been around a long time, like, it's what scares me a lot about a lot of the stuff that's going on right now with Docker is I feel like the move towards the Docker file and like the way we're shipping around containers has this similar problem where like, oh, well, the container just does the thing, right? And there's no like history of how it got to be that way, or like if I have to go reproduce it, there's no way to know how I went from, and file system to working service.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. I think it's all about the people that are doing it. You can do it right. Like if you always build from a Docker file and you have a CI process that keeps history, you can always follow that. But there are plenty of people that build a Docker container by doing a Docker run base, running a bunch of commands, and then committing it. You're like, what's even on there?
Exactly.
That's where you run into that. So one thing the other thing in the Docker ecosystem is I keep finding myself back writing bash scripts. And like even doing the etcd stuff, I'm doing it with bash scripts. And I'm like, how did this happen? How did I get back here? And I mean, I think tooling is going to catch up, and it's going to start moving back away from bash scripts. But it's just interesting that every time there's something new, we all just seem to default back to writing bash until someone else comes along and makes it easier.
Well, and my favorite will forever be I'm sitting at Scale last year, and we're in this awesome Docker presentation, and like I know that Docker only runs an process and it has to run in the foreground. I nudge my boss and point her at the screen, which happens to have the Docker file up, or the start command up, and I go, look at the arguments to Apache. And the look on her face as she saw the flag to run Apache in foreground mode was just priceless. Like, yeah. Oh, by the way, you can't SSH into that either. It's just a thing.
Yeah.
So, because I can, like, And I would totally plug the other groups that are doing things if I knew what they were doing. But since I know what Chef is doing, I will say it. So like one of the things we've seen a lot of in the Docker space is like people will take and instead of their PID1 being the application, it'll be like run it.
Yep.
So we've done something similar where you can actually do like, it's called Chef Container, and it allows you to basically do the Chef thing. And like, I don't understand all the specifics around it. I should probably go watch the webinar. But the idea being that it runs as PID1, and you can use it to manage the service state. So like, oh, you know, Chef turns on this thing, Chef turns on that thing, and oh, by the way, Chef keeps the damn thing running because it's PID1 now and doesn't exit.
Yep. From memory, it does something where it looks at any of the service calls, and I think there's an attribute you set listing the things you want to become services, and it uses that to rejigger all any of the existing service calls into run it calls and builds them using run it inits instead. And that way, even a cookbook that has service calls will, in theory, work. Because that was kind of the big hurdle for a lot of people is you can't just run the Apache cookbook in a Docker container because it can't run the Apache service. So you can converge it, but then at the end of the converge, you still now run Apache in the foreground.
Well, and that's the other argument I make. Like that is the one place where, you know, we were doing this when I was at Demand. Like we were starting to build out AWS services, and we really liked the idea for certain things to use that. And you know, once again, I'm like, people are going to strike me down with lightning for even saying it this way, but like the ephemeral infrastructure movement of, well, our deployable object is an instance ID or is an AMI. I'm totally cool with that. I get it. But you can pry Puppet or Chef out of my cold dead fingers because I am not going back to the day where I'm writing a goddamn shell script to go through and configure my infrastructure. Like, I'm using Packer with Puppet to stand up the image proxy service and do the things. And I absolutely right now, like, if I were to go back to doing that, ironically or unironically, I would use Chef for the same thing. And the reason being is a lot of the things I was doing in Puppet, I had to write bash scripts for anyway because I couldn't do them in Puppet. So, and like there's native stuff in Chef that does a lot of that. But, you know, that aside, like still that idea of both Puppet, Chef, and, you know, I can't speak to Ansible or Salt because I like don't run them and haven't run them, is that idea of I've got this DSL, I've got this framework that allows me to do things in a sane way, in a sane, repeatable fashion over and over again. I want to keep doing that. And the nice part is it then translates to non-immutable infrastructure as well. So
right. And I think if you're running true microservices where really all your Docker container is pip install blah run blah, and then inject some environment variables to tell it where my database is, then I think, okay, that's 4 lines of shell, go for it. But nobody really makes true microservices. So you're going to end up with a 300-line bash script that's trying its very best to be immutable but isn't quite. And yeah.
We are going to have to, that's another drinking topic. I feel like I've come up with lots of drinking topics, but yes, we should also, like, yes, Hangops at times, I feel like we need to have a buzzword bingo card.
So that's the thing. Do you abstract Docker all the way up to be this container runs this service, or do you try and set up Docker as if it was this container runs this ecosystem of different services, almost like a VM? Like, is that still decided to do, or is that still up in the air?
Well, the theory is that your Docker container runs a service, but the tooling isn't there to really join all the services together. And
Okay.
so people will run a bunch of services in it or whatever, or they'll have a bunch of really sketchy, you know, string and sticky tape to try and make it all work together.
Kind of like a Kafka messaging for a distributed system.
Right. And so like running Apache in a Docker container, you probably should never do that unless the only thing you really want to run is Apache. So if you want to run Apache as like a reverse proxy in front of a bunch of other Docker containers that are running like a Python Flask app, then you would start up the Python Flask apps, then run the Apache in front of it, and have some sort of tooling so it knows how to talk to them. And that would be kind of your microservices. But if you're running Apache and you've got a bunch of Python stuff and you've got a bunch of other stuff in the one, then it starts to, I mean, it's not that it's wrong, it's just it starts to, like, why don't I just do this in a VM?
Right. So what would be the benefit then of microservices? Would it just be repeatability of you can tear a microservice down and put it back up instantly?
Yeah, basically you're kind of going towards that kind of the 12 factor way of developing apps, right? Where I have I do the build, which is just the app, and I do the release, which is the app plus the environment variables that sets up the app to talk to the rest of the infrastructure, or whatever. And then you have the release, which is running it. And then you can just like, if you're just changing config, you're just creating a new release. If you're changing the app itself, you do a rebuild. And so it's very quick and easy to swap one out for another, roll forward, roll back, because you've got these
Okay.
you've got these stateless states, You've got these stateless like immutable objects, and the state is elsewhere. But of
Right.
course,
So
the
you can.
problem is, like at the end of the day, there's still state somewhere, and that's kind of where a lot of the PaaS kind of things fall apart. Is someone somewhere is running state for you,
Well, it's why,
and it's
like, you're getting the operations people that look at these immutable infrastructure articles, and I think they're really neat in what they're doing. But if you take a step back and look at all of them, it's oh, we made the state someone else's problem.
right.
We made the database someone else's problem. We made the load balancer, which has to maintain state, someone else's problem. Like, there's this constant, like, it's someone else's problem.
But a lot of the times they're not honest about the fact they've made it someone else's problem. And so people don't really find out about it until they're actually trying to actively use it, and they go, "Wait, where's where is my database?" Like, or if you do get a database, it's like a single database running in a container which has no resiliency whatsoever.
Yeah,
Which, if you've set this up for like a building up dev environments, that's one thing. But maybe you're finding this out because your CTO decided you were going to run your production infrastructure on it. Now you're the guy that has to go back and tell him, well, we can't really because we don't really have databases.
yeah,
So now,
and I think the other pain point that I think we're not addressing enough is the visibility into the containers. Like I get it. If you are Facebook, if you are Twitter, if you are an organization that is deployed at some like large ass scale, you have absolutely learned how to not have to SSH to a box to troubleshoot it. But even then, I'm willing to bet that there are still times where the way you figure out why it's broken is someone SSHs to an instance and takes a look around and goes, "Oh,
yeah,
what the hell is this doing? We should probably add a metric for that."
yeah.
And
So
if
that
you
that's that story is actually starting to show up, and so there is ns enter, which then is wrapped by docker enter. So you can run docker enter and the container name, and you just pop into a shell in the container, and so that gives you the SSH equivalent. Obviously, you've got to run it from the host that's running the container, but that's not that big a problem. There's Google released C Advisor, which basically runs on the host. You run one of them on every host. It's a container, and it will report metrics for every container. And it's got a little RESTful interface and stuff for then pulling those metrics off. And then the other one is there's a log thing that Jeff Lindsay has done, which basically watches the Docker log stream and just takes all of the Docker logs, basically container ID, log line, and then ships them off somewhere for you. So that stuff's really starting to form itself up now. It's been missing for a long time, and it's still got a ways to go, but it is finally starting to get there.
that is exciting to hear.
So it's
And
all coming. It's all coming together as a container VNC server almost.
oh, And that's the scary part, right? Like, we're just finding all the fun, reinventing certain wheels. It's kind of interesting. But with that note, I say it is time to call it a day since we're at noon Pacific time, because I know neither of you guys are actually in Pacific time. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all next week at 11 a.m. PDT. Always looking for topic suggestions if there are things people want to talk about specifically. Otherwise, I try and come up with something. No promises, though. So.
Cool. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. See ya.